Dog by Daniel Pennac, chapters 14 through 16. A well-trained owner. Dog always waits up at this point in his dream. He's just seen the black man and the last look Wooly gave him. Dog opens his eyes. He's been woken by the sound of his own whimpering. This time, Plum wakes up too. It's not Dog's whimpering that has made her stir, but something inside her saying, "Wake up, Dog's upset." She runs out of her bedroom, rushes into the kitchen, and picks up a trembling dog. She walks barefoot on the kitchen tiles, even though she's not supposed to. She takes Dog into her bedroom, even though it's out of bounds. She tucks him up beside her in bed, even though it's strictly forbidden. And then she begins whispering very gently in his ear. "Was it that nightmare again? Don't worry, Dog. I'm here now. I'll never leave you. Never." She whispers until Dog is so relaxed he falls asleep again. He's proud of himself too. Black Nose and Wooly would approve. Plum is a good owner. Dog trained her well. It hasn't been easy, mind you. Not easy at all. Chapter 15. Hooray for Seagulls. The first few days went smoothly. Plum had made up her mind to comfort Dog, who sobbed from morning to night. And when Plum decided on something, she never left Dog's side. She squeezed him against her chest and spoke tenderly to him. It wasn't the same voice she'd used at the dog pound. It was a voice that came from inside her. And when Dog heard it, he felt as if he was actually inside Plum, her words wrapping him in warm, humming blanket. Little by little, he stopped crying. She took him to the beach. He chased seagulls. "Look at that beanpole," Mr. Mussel sneered. "Can't catch a fly, but he'll never stop chasing those seagulls. Stupid animal. Dogs." And then Mr. Mussel decided it was his turn to get up and start running. He didn't chase anything. He just ran, squatted down, stretched out his arms, took a few deep breaths, got up, and started running all over again. He kept it up for hours on end. When he finished his workout, he lay down next to Mrs. Squeak. He seemed very pleased with himself. Goodness knows why. "You're soaking again, said Mrs. Squeak crossly. She was right. He never went swimming, but he was always dripping wet from head to toe. "Gotta keep trim," he replied, trying to make his head touch his knees. Running to keep fit and sweating like a waterfall made Mr. Mussel give off a peculiar smell. The upshot was that Dog never got too close to Mr. Mussel. And he didn't get too close to Mrs. Squeak either, because while Mr. Mussel was developing his muscles and body odor with all that running, jumping, and sweating, Mrs. Squeak spent all day long getting a peculiar bottle out of her handbag and spraying herself with it. The first time, Dog was sitting right next to her. She got the bottle out, unscrewed it ludicrously complicated lid, and started spraying everywhere, head, shoulders, even behind her ears. When a few drops fell on Dog's nose, he suffered a terrible sneezing fit. He was sneezing so violently, he thought he'd die. His nostrils felt like they'd been sprinkled with pepper. "What's the matter? What's going on? For goodness sake, stop sneezing. Yuck! These animals are so unhygienic," squeaked Mrs. Squeak. She squeaked so loudly, Dog ran to hide behind Plum's legs. "What have you done to my dog?" asked Plum in a flash, and her voice spelled trouble. "I haven't done anything to him, my pet. He's the one who keeps spluttering all over me. It's disgusting." "My dog isn't disgusting," said Plum with a strange glint in her eyes. "I don't advise anyone call my dog disgusting." And then she started chasing after the seagulls with Dog. They looked like splashes of silver in the sky, and their wings gleamed white. It was a beautiful sight. Dog ran and jumped, but sometimes instead of seagulls flying away, he saw something else against the blue sky. Something white and heavy that made of metal and spun around as it fell. Dog would stop in his tracks and let out a long wail, just as he had done in front of Black Nose's corpse. Then he'd remember only the last look Wooly had given him, and he'd carry on, wailing until Plum took him in her arms, squeezed him against her chest, and let him hear the warm voice inside her. Chapter 16. The day Dog finally got his name was another happy memory from those early days. That particular evening, friends from the campsite had gathered around Mr. Mussel and Mrs. Squeak's caravan. Mr. Mussel, Mrs. Squeak, and Plum always spent their summer vacation at this campsite, which wasn't very far from town. The heat was suffocating, but they insisted on lighting a fire to make it more of a party. Dog didn't think it made it more of a party. He just thought it was too hot. They lined up 4 or 5 tables end to end, covered them with food, and planted a forest of bottles on them. Everybody was sitting around the tables, and Dog was sitting on Plum's lap. Plum had the seat of honor, which was probably why Mr. Mussel kept calling her my little princess. And it was probably because of the bottles that everyone kept singing louder and louder. Dog didn't think their voices sounded tuneful. He thought they were too loud. It gave him the jitters. He'd never seen or heard so many human beings all at once. He tried to make himself as small as possible on Plum's lap so they'd forget about him, but it didn't work. All of a sudden, Mr. Mussel raised his glass very high and bellowed, "Call me old-fashioned, but I reckon we should christen this mongrel." This mongrel meant dog. Good idea, let's give him a name," bawled the guests, who always agreed with Mr. Mussel. Plum squeezed Dog a bit more tightly. "What do you think, my little princess?" "I'll have to see," she shrugged. "What kind of name are you suggesting?" Everyone suddenly went very quiet. No one had the faintest idea. "Well, actually, as a matter of fact, what kind of name?" And for the first time in life, Dog saw human beings thinking. It was an interesting sight. They started off looking at one another, cocking their eyebrows and hunching their shoulders. They pinched their chins and stared into space. They scratched their heads and shuffled their feet. And finally, they all turned back to Mr. Mussel to ask him if he'd come up with anything yet. "I'm still thinking," Mr. Mussel replied. And so everyone set to thinking again. Dog was beginning to enjoy the evening's entertainment. Mr. Mussel was very funny when he was thinking. He wrinkled his forehead like a bulldog and stuck out his lower jaw. Dog almost expected to hear his brain fizzing and popping. Mr. Mussel had turned an even deeper shade of red than usual. All the guests fell quiet as they watched him. Things went on like that for a while. Eventually, Mr. Mussel announced in a solemn voice, "I've got it." "What? Well, tell us, go on, what will it be?" Everyone burst out. He took a sip of wine and said, "Rex." He took another sip and asked, "What do you think?" There was a round of applause. "Perfect, excellent, very original, bravo!" Mr. Mussel looked at Plum with great pride, but as he was opening his mouth to ask her if she liked Rex, Plum declared, quite simply, "No." And Dog let out a sigh of relief. "No? Why ever not?" asked Mrs. Squeak, hoping to avoid an argument. "Because Rex isn't a name for real dogs. It's a name you give to dogs in books. And anyways, everyone calls their dog Rex. That's why not. And no means no." There was an awkward silence punctuated by the clinking of washing up. Someone suggested, "What about Lassie, then?" "No," answered Plum. "I don't like Lassie either. It's the name of a dog in a movie." Silence again. People were starting to realize that finding a name wasn't going to be easy after all. A cloud seemed to settle over the table, particularly over Mr. Mussel's head. A black cloud that threatened to spark flashes of lightning, which is why everybody began to chip in. Buster? Prince? Ruffles? Pluto? Fido? Sultan? Lancelot? Baron? Tarquin? Hal? Each time, Plum gave the simple reply, "No." And sometimes she gave a reason. "Too ugly, boring, pretentious. So many dogs are called that those days." Until the black cloud finally burst over Mr. Mussel's head. "All right, then. Why don't you come up with a name yourself if you're so smart? Go on, hurry up and find one. Nothing yet. Getting there? We're waiting." "Dog," answered Plum, just like that. "Dog?" "Yes. And dog? What? You are going to call your dog Dog?" "My dog will be called Dog," Plum explained patiently. "What do you mean, dog?" asked Mr. Mussel, with his eyes popping out of his head. "Dog? That's not a name." "It's the nicest, simplest, most original name I can think of. I don't know of any dog called Dog." And then she added, "apart from mine," with a look that meant the matter had been settled and there was no going back. "But all dogs are called Dog, my pet." Mrs. Squeak laughed awkwardly. Think about it. That's where you'd find them, under D in the dictionary. And she glanced apologetically to the guests. I've thought about it, and my dog is going to be called Dog with a capital D, because there's only one dog like him in the whole wide world. You can say that again, agreed Mr. Mussel, winking slyly at everybody. Actually, I think you're quite right, not giving him a name. He's probably too far stupid to answer to anyone. Plum didn't reply. She smiled, stood up, and said, Good night, everyone. Dog didn't know what else to do, so he stayed sitting on the chair until Plum asked without turning around, Are you coming, Dog? Dog instantly rushed to her as if he'd been called Dog all of his life.